Welcome, everybody, and cheers. We just finished reading Ezra. Now we're going to take a deep dive into Ezra. Israel gets a second chance. Persians from what is now Iran overrun the Babylonian capital near what is now Baghdad in Iraq. Suddenly, the Middle East changes hands. The Babylonian Empire gives way to the Persian Empire, stretching from India to the east of the northern African countries of Egypt and Libya in the west. The Persian king Cyrus issues a decree. He frees Babylon's political prisoners, refugees deported from their conquered homeland. This includes the Jews. Cyrus urges the Jews to rebuild their Jerusalem temple. He even gives them back the temple furnishings that the Babylonians had stolen. And so 50 years after the deported Jews arrived in Babylon, they load up caravans and head back home. Once there, they rebuild the temple. And on this side note, caravanning home, pushing on to sundown, a camel caravan passes near Jerusalem in the early 1900s. Ezra and other Jews followed a 1,000-mile caravan route from what is now Iraq to Jerusalem in a journey that took 4 months. And here's a picture of the caravan. A priest named Ezra arrives in Jerusalem almost a century later, and he begins teaching the people the laws of Moses. This sparks a dramatic revival, leading to widespread repentance in what must be a bitterly controversial decision. Many Jewish men even divorce their non-Jewish wives. They do this because the law urges them not to marry outside the Jewish faith. Such marriages, the law explains, can lead people into idolatry. And idolatry is why the Jews spent the past generation exiled in a foreign country. And idolatry is actually what is destroying the world these days, because people decide to worship other things than worship God. They don't want to go through that misery again. The main point of this book, God gives the Jewish people a fresh start, a chance to rebuild their nation on godly principles, and after spending half a century in exile because they didn't do this the first time, the Jews are highly motivated to get it right this time. The writer isn't identified. Ancient Jewish tradition says it was written by Ezra, a priest who helped rebuild the Jewish nation after the 50-year exile. In the first copies of the Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah appeared as a single book. The date. The story covers about 100 years from the time the first Jews returned from exile in about 538 BC until Ezra's arrival and ministry in the mid-400s BC. Location. The stories are set in 2 locations: Israel and the Persian Empire, based now in what is Iran. Israel's second exodus, Ezra 1:3, and of you who are his gods, people may go to Jerusalem and Judah to rebuild this temple of the Lord, and may your God be with you. For 50 years the Jewish people have been living a 1,000-mile walk from their homeland. Babylonian invaders deported them out of Israel in 586 BC and forced them to move to what is now Iraq. But in 539 BC, Persians conquered the Babylonian Empire. The ruler of this new superpower, King Cyrus, issues a decree releasing the Jews to go home and rebuild their temple along with their nation. A clay cylinder surviving from Cyrus's day confirms that this was his policy for all Babylon's former deportees. An entire generation of Jews has grown up in Babylon. They don't all decide to return home, but more than 42,000 do. In some ways, the exodus home is reminiscent of the Israelite exodus of Egypt nearly 1,000 years earlier. But instead of having to buck a hostile ruler determined to hang on to the Jews as a cheap source of slave labor, this generation enjoys a Persian ruler who sends them off with his blessing. Cyrus gives the Jews 5,400 articles of gold and silver previously confiscated from them by the Babylonians, including some sacred furnishings from the temple. Cyrus also orders their Babylonian neighbors to send them off with gifts of gold, silver, and livestock to help them on their way. Rebuilding the temple. Ezra 3:8. Construction of the temple of God began in mid-spring during the second year after they arrived in Jerusalem. The workforce was made up of everyone who had returned from exile. The returning Jews take up an offering among themselves to buy supplies for rebuilding the temple. They come up with about half a ton of gold and 3 tons of silver. That sounds like a lot, but it's a minuscule fraction of what David had stockpiled for his son Solomon to use in buying supplies for the first temple. 4,000 tons of gold and 40,000 tons of silver. It's easier to see the staggering difference in money raised when we convert the gold and silver to dollars. When gold sells for $550 an ounce and silver for $10 an ounce on today's market, the amount David raised was about $83 billion compared to about $9 million raised by the returning refugees. The Jews take a couple of years to get settled into their homes and establish their gardens and flocks. They also build an altar so they can begin offering sacrifices to God. Then during their second spring back, perhaps in April or May of 536 BC, they lay the foundation for the temple. Perhaps the foundation looks small or it lacks the high quality craftsmanship of Solomon's temple. For though the young people cheer for joy at what they see, the older people who remember the first temple begin crying. The writer doesn't say why they cry, but the implication is that they know they're getting what they paid for, an inferior temple. Now, Jewish locals who have settled in the land hate to see the Jews returning and rebuilding their nation. They start lobbying the Persian government to make the Jews stop working on this first major building project. The locals eventually succeed. First, they bribe Persian officials who somehow slow the Jewish efforts. Then they convince a new king, Artaxerxes, that the Jews have a long history of rebelling against the empires they are supposed to serve. So the king orders all work stop. The work resumes a couple of decades later during the reign of King Darius. That's after the Jews convince him to search the royal record and find Cyrus's original decree urging the Jews to rebuild their temple. Darius finds the records. Then he not only orders the work to continue without interference, he also orders his governor to use tax money to pay for the construction. On March 12, 515 BC, the temple is finished. The date is this precise because Ezra cross-references events that match surviving Persian records. Putting the two together provides the date. Though this temple is just a shadow of Solomon's elegant worship center and the humblest of the three temples that the Jews built during their history, it lasts longer than any other, 500 years. That compares to about 400 years of Solomon's temple and less than 100 years of Herod's temple in New Testament times. A priest condemns interracial marriage. Ezra 10:10-11. You have committed a terrible sin by marrying pagan women. You have increased Israel's guilt. So now confess your sin to the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do what he demands. Separate yourselves from the people of the land and from these pagan women. About 70 years after the first wave of Jews leave Babylon for Israel, a priest named Ezra joins a second wave headed home. There are perhaps a few thousand Jews in this group. Ezra refers to about 1,500 men, but he's apparently not counting women and children. The priests leave Babylon on April 8, 458 BC, following one of several caravan routes up to the Euphrates River. Following one of several caravan routes up the Euphrates River and then turning south, he arrives in Jerusalem 4 months later on August 4th. He's met by a group of Jewish leaders with a complaint. Many Jewish men have married non-Jewish women, so the holy race has become polluted by these mixed marriages. And that's in Ezra 9:2. The Jewish elders are concerned about a particular law from the time of Moses. This law forbids Jews from marrying non-Jewish locals who will lead their children away from me to worship other gods. Deuteronomy 7:4. This is what led to the exile. Oddly, it all began with a king famous for his wisdom. Solomon brought idolatry to Israel on a national scale when he married non-Jewish women who eventually convinced him to build shrines to their gods. The Jews don't want a repeat of their recent tragic history, complete with another invasion and deportation. Ezra goes to the temple where he lies on the ground, weeping and confessing the nation's fresh sin. There a man makes a plea to Ezra. The man is Shechaniah, a son of Jehiel and a descendant of Elam. he urges Ezra to order all Jewish men to divorce their non-Jewish wives and to send them away along with their children. Ezra does as requested, though his demand seems both harsh and controversial. Some Jews of the day likely considered the ancient law out of date, pertinent only to the Israelites in Joshua's time. After all, it referred to Canaanites of the conquered era, of the Canaanites of the conquest era. Also, David's dynasty began specifically because a Jewish man married a non-Jew, Ruth. She was from Moab in what is now Jordan. She became David's great-grandmother, and she loved God. In fact, it's possible that Ruth's story survived in the Bible partly because it's an effective counterpoint to Ezra's order. Some Bible experts wonder if Shechaniah had an ulterior motive for his request. His father is listed among the 113 Jewish men married to non-Jews. In Ezra 10:26, it says, from the family of Elam, Mattaniah, Zechariah, Jehiel. Perhaps Jehiel had 2 or more wives. If Shechaniah was Jehiel's son by a Jew, Shechaniah might have had plenty to gain by eliminating his half-brothers. At the least, he would have increased his inheritance because his disowned brothers would have gotten nothing. And if Jehiel's oldest son had been from a non-Jewish woman, Shechaniah might have taken that son's place as the new head of the clan once Jehiel died. In that case, Shechaniah would have received a double share of inheritance, twice as much as any of his younger brothers. Whether or not God wanted the men to divorce their wives, Ezra and other leaders came to that conclusion. Jewish law, however, does not call for divorce after such a marriage. If it did, the Jews might have missed out on the greatest dynasty of kings in their history. Ezra's numbers do not add up. The book of Ezra and Nehemiah, originally one book, each say there were 42,360 Jews who returned to Israel in the first wave. And that's Ezra 264 and Nehemiah 766. But when the two passages break down the list by families, the numbers don't add up. Ezra's list adds up to only 29,818. Nehemiah's list adds up to 31,089. Bible experts can only guess why the Bible ends up with 3 different totals. 1. Scribes copying worn-out, faded scrolls onto new scrolls made mistakes, perhaps skipping some of the families listed on earlier manuscripts. 2. The breakdown by family was just a partial listing, even in the original. And 3. The total of 42,360 includes women, while the family listing includes only men. But this wouldn't explain why the family totals in Ezra fall 1,271 short of those in Nehemiah. Perhaps a scribe got some numbers wrong. Ezra lists 1,222 men in the family of Azgad, for example, in Nehemiah's list 2,322. In that family, several other family numbers are off as well, though there are occasional discrepancies like this in the Bible. The discrepancies are incredibly few, a tribute to the care that scribes took in creating fresh copies. The discrepancies don't affect the Bible's teachings. The Great Scroll of Isaiah, for example, was found among the famous Dead Sea Scrolls and was 1,000 years older than the Isaiah scroll that scholars use to translate the King James Version of the Bible, yet it's nearly identical to the copy a millennium younger. The discrepancies are only minor changes that seem like copying mistakes and that don't affect the message of the book. With just one exception, good King Josiah. Sorry, I went into an old. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown, and sorry for the mistake. I went into an older book. Actually, kind of ran into the Second Kings breakdown, so sorry about that. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Stay blessed. Stay blessed. Stay caffeinated. Much love.